So welcome to our webinar on building the Brooklyn Bridge with Gary Midkiff. I can tell you a little bit about Gary. Gary is really a regular at our library because he leads our Great Decisions discussion group, which is a foreign policy discussions group twice a month. And we've been doing this for many years. I don't know, maybe 8 years or something along those lines. It's been a long time.
Many.
But he also leads discussions and lectures about history and foreign policy throughout the Chicago area. And we are really pleased to have him with us tonight for this lecture format. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you. In 2007, in downtown Minneapolis, a bridge collapsed and a number of people were killed. The collapse of that bridge in Minneapolis led the federal government to launch a fairly immediate and nationwide examination of older bridges to see if there was some maintenance that needed to be done that for some reason had not been. And one of the first bridges that were examined was the Brooklyn Bridge because of its age. And the report came back fairly quickly that the Brooklyn Bridge was absolutely, positively, 100% safe and secure. There were some difficulties with some of the entrance ramps to the bridge, which have nothing to do with the bridge structure itself, but the bridge itself was absolutely safe and did not need any further consideration. Given the fact of when the bridge was built in the latter part of the 19th century, that's a pretty strong testament to how the bridge was constructed and the engineering that went into it. And we will learn some things about that this evening as we go forward. As you know, I am a person who focuses on history and foreign policy, and I don't know engineering at all. So although I will show some videos that talk about engineering because the people on the videos are more knowledgeable than me, what attracts me to this story has to do with personalities and people. And for reference, I suggest, if you've not read about the Brooklyn Bridge, that the book by David McCullough about the Brooklyn Bridge would be a good place to start. Obviously, the Ken Burns documentary is a good place also. But I believe that the McCullough book does a really, really good job. And when I first read that many years ago, that piqued my interest in the Brooklyn Bridge, which led me to put this program together. There are three people whose stories intertwine and are critical to this. The first is John Augustus Roebling. He is the person who came over from Germany. He was the entrepreneur engineer who started a number of manufacturing companies and started to design bridges. As a matter of fact, if you have been to Cincinnati, Ohio, and you've driven across the Ohio River to Covington, Kentucky, you have driven across the first suspension bridge that the Roebling company constructed. He is part of the story. The second part of the story is his son, Washington Roebling. Washington Roebling has a bit of Civil War background. We will talk about that. And he is Augustus's son. The third person who is integral to the story is Emily Roebling, Washington's wife. And by the end of the evening, what will become clear is that Emily is actually the hero of the story. She doesn't get a whole lot of credit these days. But interestingly, when the Brooklyn Bridge was officially completed and pedestrian traffic was first allowed to walk across, Emily was the very, very first person to be allowed to walk across the bridge. There are also some side stories, and my favorite side story has to do with P.T. Barnum, but he will come near the end of the evening. We're not going to hear about P.T. just yet. That's going to come near the end of the evening. The city of New York and the city of Brooklyn, which at the time were separate cities, knew from the early 1800s that going across the East River to connect the two was something that would be advantageous, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. How do you build a bridge that can do that? So there were ferries that went back and forth. But the problem with the ferries, of course, is that since it was New York City, when the river would freeze, the ferries didn't work so well. And then there was the cost, and then there was the traffic, ferries going back and forth and shipping traffic going up and down. So there was a whole lot of congestion. The concept of having a bridge was certainly attractive, but how to do it was just not feasible for a very, very long period of time. After the Civil War, the mayors of the two cities got together and said, we've got to try to connect ourselves. So let's put out what we would now call an RFP, a request for proposal. That wasn't the term used at the time, to see if someone can come up with an idea about building a bridge that can connect Brooklyn and New York, technically Manhattan. Let's see what we get. And so an RFP was issued and a number of responses were made. But the response which was the most detailed and which was the most attractive was the one that was done by John Augustus Roebling. He submitted it, and he had an interesting letter attached to his submission. And in his letter, he said the following: "The contemplated work, when constructed in accordance with my design, will not only be the greatest bridge in existence, but it will be the great engineering work of the continent and of the age. Its most conspicuous feature, the two great towers, will serve as landmarks to the adjoining cities, and they will be entitled to be ranked as national monuments. As a great work of art and a successful specimen of advanced bridge engineering, the structure will forever testify to the energy, enterprise, and wealth of that community which shall secure its erection." Roebling's proposal was the winning proposal, and he got the contract. Now, his proposal was for a suspension bridge, and a suspension bridge is very, very unique in terms of not only how it's built, but also how it handles the weight which it's going to be subjected to. So in a minute, I'm going to show you the first of three videos you will see tonight. And this video has to do with the architecture perspective of how a suspension bridge works. Once you see that, then when I talk about the construction process, it will make more sense. In any case, John Augustus Roebling wins the contract. He's very excited. He goes back to New York City, and now he needs to take some more detailed measurements. He needs to try to determine the amount of water, how deep the bedrock is, those sorts of things. So he goes back and starts doing measurements. And this takes place in late 1867. And while he is doing this, there is a small industrial accident. His foot is crushed between a boat he was on and a pier. The foot's crushed. That didn't necessarily cause some pain, but that didn't cause his demise. The demise was caused by the gangrene that set in after his foot was crushed, and within a couple of weeks, he died. So the Roebling Company has won the contract. John Augustus Roebling has designed the bridge, and he's dead. So who's going to take over the project? Well, the answer is his son, Washington. Now, Washington was a trained engineer. And during the Civil War, he was with the Union forces, and he functioned as part of their engineering corps, building bridges, pontoon bridges, etc. During various battles of the war. He was at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So he was active in the Army Corps of Engineers. After the Civil War ends in 1865, he goes to work for his father's company, and he assists in the building and some other projects that they have had. But he did not do the specs for the bridge. He did not evaluate how the bridge would be built, and he had never led an engineering project to building a bridge before. His father dies. He is now responsible for the company, as well as the largest project the company has ever had, building this bridge. And now he has to study as fast as he can his father's plans and calculations and estimates for how the bridge would be built. Keep in mind that this project is going to take 14 years before it is completed, from the date that it starts until the date that it finishes. 14 years. It is a massive project. And Washington, who is in his early 30s, has never led a construction project before. Let's spend a few minutes with the video that explains to us how a suspension. Give me just a minute, I'll get that video going.
From an engineering perspective, let's begin our journey with a visit to a structure that's indisputably one of the world's greatest, the Brooklyn Bridge. When we look at a magnificent work like this one, we see three essential qualities: form, function, and structure. Perhaps the most obvious of these three is function, how people use the bridge. The function of the Brooklyn Bridge is to span the East River, linking Brooklyn and Manhattan, originally for pedestrians, horse-drawn vehicles, and trolleys, but today for 6 lanes of automobile traffic. Now, back in the 1800s, that function was pretty significant, and the economic and social impacts of linking those two cities was really quite important. Today, however, it's really not the function, but the form that stimulates our emotions and captures our imagination. So what's form? Form refers to aesthetic appeal. The physical features of a building, bridge, or tower, like shape, scale, proportion, ornament. And the form of the Brooklyn Bridge certainly is beautiful. The graceful curve of those main cables, the strength and solidity of the granite towers, that intricate web of steel framework that supports the roadway. You may think of these features as being primarily aesthetic, but there's so much more. They are, in fact, a direct reflection of the scientific principles underlying the design of this great bridge. They are, in a word, structure. A system of load-carrying elements that causes the bridge to stand up. Now, to illustrate this point, I'd like to take a look at a model of a typical suspension bridge. You see here. This model consists of 2 main cables. The cables are anchored out here on the ends. They extend up over the tops of these 2 tall towers, and then they're draped across the main span in that characteristic curved shape. From the cables, you see that I have suspended a series of weights. They're equal weights, and they're all spaced an equal distance apart. So this constitutes a uniform loading on the cable. The shape of the cable, then, is a direct consequence of that loading. It's really a function of physics. The shape of the cable, mathematically speaking, is a parabola, and the parabola occurs specifically as a consequence of that loading. It's science, not aesthetics. Up at the tops of the towers, the cable makes a sharp bend, and as a direct consequence of that bend, all of the tension in the cable is transmitted downward into the towers. And so, in effect, the 2 towers are carrying the entire weight of the bridge and everything that's applied to that bridge in compression directly down through the towers. And that's why on the Brooklyn Bridge, the towers are so massive. They're such robust granite structures. So the parabolic shape of the curve of the cable is caused by the uniform loading. What happens if the loading isn't uniform? What happens, for example, if a heavy vehicle like a train or a heavy truck is crossing the span? Well, when that heavy vehicle gets out here to mid-span, note what happens. Note that the parabolic shape of the cables has now become distorted into something very different. One of the characteristic features of a cable structure is that it changes its shape in response to changes in applied loading. Well, that's all well and good, but if this is a functional suspension bridge, we have a problem, because that sort of distortion in the cable also caused a significant downward deflection of the deck that the vehicles are driving across. So imagine if you're the occupant or driver of a vehicle that's moving from one side of the bridge to the other. When the vehicle's located here, the cable distorts into this shape. As it moves to this location, the cable distorts again, but into a different shape. By the time it gets out to midspan, it's distorted into yet another shape again. And all the while, the bridge is undulating and undergoing all these crazy deformations. Clearly, it's not practical as a functional structure. And that's why most suspension bridges To include the Brooklyn Bridge, use a secondary structure called a stiffening truss, which is supported directly from the cable. And I do want to emphasize that the stiffening truss is not resting on the towers. Note that there's a space between the ends of the truss and the towers. It's entirely hanging from the cable. But now when I take this same heavy concentrated load of the vehicle crossing the bridge and we place it on the stiffening truss, we see that the shape of the cables didn't change at all. What the stiffening truss does is to distribute that heavy load out laterally so that all of these slender vertical wires, they're called suspenders, carry that load instead of just one or two suspenders, as you saw in the case of the unstiffened deck. So what we see is that all of these prominent aspects of the form of the Brooklyn Bridge, the shape of the cables, the robust stone towers, the stiffening trusses, they all derive from structural purpose. As this demonstration shows, we really can't fully appreciate and understand the Brooklyn Bridge based on its form and its function alone. We need to see and understand its structure as well. In this course.
Okay, so let's pull from that video a couple of key pieces. You notice that because the cables go over the top of those two massive stone vertical structures, that all of the weight of the bridge comes through those two arches and into the river. Okay, if that's what's going to happen, then what is happening below water? And that leads to a very interesting discussion. When John Augustus Roebling put the calculations together that led to his proposal, he knew he was going to have those two vertical towers. He knew that the towers were going to have to go into the river, and they're going to end up, one tower is going to go about 45 feet into the river, the other tower is going to go about 105 feet into the river. So the issue becomes, what sort of material are they going to encounter? Are they going to encounter bedrock? Are they going to encounter mud? What are they going to encounter when they dig? Well, first, they have to have some sort of a platform for those two vertical towers to sit in. And that introduces us to the concept of caissons, which were used for the first time in the building of this bridge. Now, to start the discussion of a caisson, I want you to imagine that you are holding a shoebox. And I want you to take the top of the shoebox and take it off, put it wherever you want to put it, and take the shoebox and turn it upside down. So now the open side of the shoebox is at the bottom and the closed side is on the top. So think of a caisson as a shoebox. The shoebox is made out of wood, and the wood is floated into position of where the vertical tower is going to go, and then it is sunk. It is sunk by putting heavy weights, stones in this case, on top of it and pushing it down through the water until it encounters some sort of material underneath. Could be bedrock, could be silt, could be mud, whatever it is. So it's pushed down until that happens. Once it's there, then the construction people are going to go into the caisson and they're going to work inside that shoebox. And what they're going to do is take out mud. They're going to ship the mud to the top surface and they're going to keep digging, and the shoebox is going to settle and settle and settle until it can settle no further. When it can settle no further, when it has reached some sort of basis that will not move any further, then concrete is going to be poured inside the caisson. The caisson is going to fill up with concrete, it's going to harden, and that's going to be the base for those two large towers that you saw. The Brooklyn Bridge sits on two caissons that were lowered into the East River in the 1870s, still there and still resting on top of it. The 44-foot deep one is resting on bedrock. The 105-foot one is actually on material at the bottom of the river, soil, if you will, But when soil samples were taken, it was determined that that soil was compressed. It hadn't moved for millennia, and it was determined that the caisson could rest on that. So although the two vertical structures are obviously the same height above water, below water, they are very different depth because of the difference of how deep the river is at that point. The use of caissons like that was revolutionary. And the caissons, you have the shoebox image, but the shoeboxes, of course, already had, if you will, elevators in them and air towers in them, so the material, so that workers could be sent down and workers could come up and the mud could come up and compressed air could be pumped in, because otherwise the people working down there would exhaust all the air. Who would be willing to do that job? Well, there's an interesting story regarding the bridge. There was a financial panic going through the country in the early 1870s when this construction was taking place. There were a lot of unemployed people, and in New York City, there in particular were a lot of unemployed immigrants. The immigrants were desperate for any sort of work they could get, mostly European immigrants, of course, and they were desperate for any work that they could get. So they volunteered to work in those conditions. The conditions were harsh, they were dangerous, and they were difficult, but those are the people who worked. There are a number of statistics that are tossed around about how many people died in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And the fact is, we don't really know, because so many of them were immigrants who really weren't cataloged or counted correctly. They were just thrown on work crews. We know that many died. You would think that if there were a lot of deaths, they would be from people working above ground near the tops of the towers. No, most of the deaths occurred underneath. And how did that happen? And why did that happen? The environment is difficult, and you'll see a video about that in a minute. The environment is difficult to work in. And here is the key issue about the people that were down there. Remember, I said there was forced air being pumped in. So the air pressure inside the caissons is very high. When workers would be brought out from that environment when their work shift was over, and they went on these little elevators up to the surface, they would suddenly go through a change in pressure and they would develop the bends. And if any of you have ever done scuba diving, you know that that is pretty dangerous, because it means that inside your blood system, you develop an imbalance in terms of how your blood is functioning, and suddenly you have tremendous muscle cramping taking place, which actually can be fatal. The people at the time didn't know what was causing all of these injuries, so they called it caisson disease. We would now call it the bends because of the change in pressure when you go too fast from one circumstance to another. But it was called caisson disease, and people were getting very sick, terrible cramps, or dying as a result. And people didn't know what the cause of it was. Eventually they figured out, but they don't know what the cause of it is. But on the flip side, without the caissons, they couldn't have those two massive vertical columns, which are absolutely critical for having the Brooklyn Bridge built. To give a picture of how bad it was working inside the caissons, I'm going to show you another video now about the construction process. And during the video, when you work with Zoom, it's really difficult to stop a video and talk over it. So I'm just going to let the video play, and then I'll make some comments afterwards. But when the video talks about the people working in the caissons, look at the design of the caissons and look at the little elevators to move people back and forth and all that sort of stuff, which is part of that upside down shoebox. When the caissons are fully sunk in whatever structure is underneath, they're filled with concrete, and that's where they stay. And then the columns can be built on top of them without people having to go inside the caissons ever again. So with that as background, let's look at a few minutes of what it was like for the people who were inside that environment. 1 second, let me get that going.
By poor immigrant workers. The first step was to build the two towers. A huge wood and steel box called a caisson was floated out into the river and sunk. Compressed air was pumped in to keep the surrounding water from leaking into the chamber. Workers, called sandhogs, got in and out of the caisson through an airlock. The floor was ripped out, and workers began digging up the riverbed. As they excavated, the caisson sank further and further, eventually hitting a stable foundation of bedrock. It was then filled with concrete. Conditions inside the caissons were terrible. They were deep beneath the surface of the East River, 78.5 feet below on the Manhattan side and 44.5 feet below on the Brooklyn side. Inside, it was very hot and difficult to breathe. Workers fatigued easily. But there was an even greater danger. Because the caissons were pumped full of air, the pressure inside was extremely high. The sandhogs called it caissons disease. Today, we call it the bends. It happens when deep-sea divers surface too quickly. Rapid ascension out of compressed air leads to an imbalance of nitrogen in the blood, causing pain and nausea. It can be fatal. And for the sandhogs, it often was. At least 20 men died in the caissons, but there can be little doubt that many more deaths went unrecorded. Once the bridge towers were completed, the rest of the bridge was suspended between them. Spinning the cables for the suspension bridge was also a very dangerous and sometimes fatal job. When the Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, it was a marvel. But it came at a very high price. The bridge cost more than $15 million to build. This was more than twice what architects originally thought it would cost. It also cost at least 30 lives, including that of its designer, John Roebling. Today, more than 150,000 vehicles cross the Brooklyn Bridge every day. Its construction led to amazing economic growth and opportunity for Brooklyn and helped turn New York City into a thriving center of commerce. But the costs of this opportunity, both financial and human, will never be forgotten.
All right, so we've identified caisson disease and what causes it. And we know that there were workers above ground who were helping to string cables. Well, let's talk about the those two parts of the story. Let's talk about caisson disease first. Washington Roebling, who is now the construction engineer, goes into the caissons frequently because he needs to supervise the work there and be sure that things are moving along appropriately. And he develops a terrible case of caisson disease. As a matter of fact, it is so severe that he becomes handicapped for the rest of his life. How handicapped? He cannot use his legs and his use of his arms are limited. He essentially is in a wheelchair. So let's hold the story there for a second. The person who owns the company who is building the bridge, the person who is supposed to be the construction engineer and project manager on the bridge, has now been affected by caisson disease and can literally not move around anymore. And the fate of his company is tied to the success of this project. I would call that a fair amount of pressure. And now we're going to start to talk about his wife, Emily, who is going to quickly become the heroine of this story. So Washington Roebling knows that one way or another, he has to get the bridge built. And he comes up with a plan, and Emily agrees. They move into an apartment in Brooklyn, and the apartment was very carefully chosen. It had to have a large living room picture window. The window had to have a clear, unobstructed view of the bridge as it would be built, and it had to be reasonably close to the bridge so that someone could go back and forth and not waste too much time. Washington is going to essentially sit in that window for the next 12 years and watch the bridge being built. And Emily is going to become his voice and his legs. Every morning, she is going to be given written instructions to go and talk to the people on site, the construction managers, about what needs to be done. She will pick up their questions and bring them back in the middle of the day to Washington, who will write out his answers. And then she will go back in the afternoon and bring the answers back. So Washington Roebling is going to watch the construction of his bridge, and Emily is going to be his voice and his legs. She has no engineer training. She has no particular mathematical training. She becomes frustrated because she doesn't know what the messages mean that she's carrying back and forth. So she starts taking night classes to understand basic engineering and math concepts that apply to the building of bridges, so she can understand what it is that Washington is asking her to do. And so the two of them develop a partnership where she goes back and forth and he observes the building of the bridge. There's a very famous painting of Washington Roebling. It's in the McCullough book, I know, that shows him in that picture window with the bridge being built behind him. But the important thing for the story tonight is to give credit to Emily, who absolutely devoted herself to her husband and the completion of the bridge. Now, fast forward, completing that bridge means that the company is going to be solvent and they're going to get other contracts in the future. So there's a long-term financial benefit for them. But at the time, Emily's willingness and ability to do that is what helps hold the project together. Second thing, you heard about the cables that are being strung. You've got the main cable that goes over the top of the two towers, and then you've got those vertical cables that help hold the flooring that go across the bottom. Those are metal cables, and they are made out of multiple strands of metal cables that are wound around together. The Roebling company, besides building suspension bridges, also was a pioneer in the building of those sorts of cables, which are used at the time for a number of industrial applications. So the type of cable that was used, metal cable that was used, was specifications from John Augustus Roebling that he learned how to calculate based upon the work that his company had done building those sorts of cables. When the construction bids go out to supply cables, the Roebling company can't build enough, so some other contractors take over the cables, which will be part of the story that we get to in a few minutes. But that's what's holding them up, are those cables, which are actually thousands and thousands of cables wound together. It looks from the outside as if it's a single cable, but it's actually multiple cables wound up inside. And so the bridge gets built. There are cost overruns, and you heard in one of the videos already that the eventual cost of the bridge will be twice what the estimate was. And this leads to two interesting stories about that. In the 1880s, New York was led by a couple of corrupt politicians, of whom the principal one was a man named Boss Tweed, who was famous for his skullduggery. And an investigative reporter for the New York Times did some investigating into what was called the Tweed Ring and found out that there was a whole lot of misallocation of funds. Eventually, this is going to lead to Tweed facing state and federal charges and Tweed going to prison. But early on in the investigative reporting, there's a lot of funds that have been siphoned off for political purposes, including funds for the bridge, because Brooklyn and New York City both contributed funds. They were supposed to go for the construction, but some of the funds had been siphoned off. So the residual funds were less than they should have been, and there were cost overruns, meaning the cost was higher. The net result is it looked very likely as if the project was going to run out of funds. Well, what do politicians do when there's a crisis? They form a committee. So they formed a committee to do an investigation, and they tried to pin the blame on Washington Roebling for poor project management. That's why there were cost overruns. It is interesting because when the New York City Council held its public hearings to try to determine who to blame, The major contractors and project managers from the project all came and testified on behalf of Washington Roebling. They said, no one understands this project better than him. There are cost overruns, yes, but it's not his fault. And if you remove him from the project will fail. And you'll have this thing in the river that's never going to be completed. Eventually, the New York City Council decided that Washington Roebling wasn't the problem, and the project was allowed to continue with some additional funding that had to be provided. The project continues. And now they have the suspensions hanging, and now they're working on the roadway going across. People can see that there is progress being made that makes them a little bit more comfortable. But now we have another issue that pops up. Let's go back to those steel cables. John Augustus Roebling calculated how strong the cables had to be, how much weight the bridge would have to support, and how strong the cables would have to be metallurgically to be able to support it. And for some reason, using what I would call poor manufacturing techniques, those of us who are familiar with modern quality techniques know this is not what happens now, because you inspect materials before they even ship to the job site to be sure they're in spec. But that didn't happen. So all this cable is coming in, the bridge is being constructed, and for some reason, one of the project managers said, I think we should probably inspect some of the inbound cable, just be sure it's up to spec. And when the cable was checked to see if it met the strength characteristics, it was found out to be way short of spec. In other words, it wasn't as strong as the specification called for. Keep in mind that much of the bridge was already constructed with these cables in place, but now it was determined that the cable was below spec. Washington stopped the construction and sat down with some engineers and went back over Augustus Roebling's calculations, and they found something out. Now, when a project of this nature is constructed, you always put in factors of what is the worst possible situation. For example, the Twin Towers, the two structures that were destroyed in the attack on 9/11, they were constructed to withstand a 200-mile-per-hour hurricane, which, by the way, has never happened in New York City. But they were constructed to be able to withstand that because they wanted to have safety. So when John Augustus Roebling did the calculations for the cable, he came up with what the load would be, the maximum load that the bridge would have to support, and he multiplied it by a factor of 6. If there are any engineers in the audience, you people are quickly realizing that that does two things. One, that's going to be a really strong bridge. Number two, the cost is going to go up because if you're going to make cabling that strong, you're going to have to put extra manufacturing effort into it. True enough, but the specs led to cable that was going to be 6 times stronger than the maximum load. So when Washington Roebling understood how strong the specs were and then looked at the cabling that had been provided, the cabling provided was 4 times stronger than would be necessary, but that was less than the spec. So in other words, the cable was out of spec, but it was way stronger than was going to be necessary, which means, thank goodness, that the bridge did not have to be deconstructed, that the cable could be used. Now, the principal company that provided the insufficient cable was, of course, sued, and they went bankrupt, and that was the end of that. But the cable that had been provided could be used. That was important because then the project did not have to stop. Project work continues. There are some deaths, as you heard about that, but now that there's confidence in the cable, the project is being finished in the early 1880s, 14 years after the start. And after spending all those years in the apartment front room watching the bridge is now at the point of completion. There's going to be a massive ceremony. As a matter of fact, the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, is going to come and visit for the official opening of the Brooklyn Bridge, because now, of course, everyone is all excited and willing to claim credit for the bridge being successfully built, et cetera, et cetera. The official opening takes place, and Emily is the first person to walk the length of the bridge, kind of an honor. And then the next day, there is the official celebration. Chester Arthur walks across, the mayors of New York and Brooklyn walk across, there's fireworks, et cetera, and everyone's very, very happy. The Brooklyn Bridge is now open for traffic, which includes a pedestrian level, as well as a level for, at that point, train tracks that went across. Now it's a 6 lanes of highway, 3 lanes in each direction, but at that point it was train tracks. And now the Brooklyn Bridge is open. The first weekend that it is open, there are thousands of people walking back and forth because it's pretty exciting. There's never been a bridge like this before. And the tops of those towers are now the second tallest structures in New York City. There's a church spire, which is a few feet taller, but it's a really exciting place to be. Well, as people are walking back and forth on the bridge and enjoying the view, a rumor starts. Why did the rumor start? Who knows? There's a rumor that starts that goes, the bridge is starting to crack and it's going to fail and you need to run off the bridge as quickly as you can. And so people on the bridge start running for both ends, depending upon how close they are, because they don't want to fall into the river because the bridge is supposedly falling apart, which, by the way, was not true. At one end of the bridge, there are still some construction fences, et cetera, which are there. People slam into the fences and then people behind them slam into them and crush them, and multiple people are killed. And although the bridge was not, in fact, in any way in danger, now people are concerned that there had to be a reason for the rumor. Something may have been wrong, and officials are trying to cover it up. The bridge isn't safe, but officials don't want to admit it. And now the city fathers of New York and Brooklyn have a problem, which is people are now worried about whether the bridge is actually safe. Enter P.T. Barnum. And this is my only presentation where P.T. Barnum emerges as a hero of sorts. So here's what happens. So Barnum is coming to New York at that point because his circus is going to have a 1-week run in New York City. And he hears about this. So he contacts the 2 mayors and he says, I have an idea for you. I've got a lot of elephants in my show, and I can arrange to have the elephants in single file walk across the bridge, walk back across the bridge, and if it's strong enough to support my elephants, it's going to be able to support people, and I won't even charge you for this. Well, politicians go, wow, marketing opportunity with no cost. That sounds good. So they say to Mr. Barnum, okay, you can do that. Well, Barnum does. He arranges for his elephants to come across, but of course the elephants have huge signs on both sides of them, marketing, of course, and the signs say, next week, the Barnum Circus is going to be at New York, and you should come and see the Brooklyn Bridge elephants who will be performing at the show. Elephants go across the bridge. They turn around, they come back across the bridge. The bridge, of course, is fine, stands there. And Barnum's circus in New York is extended for multiple weeks. He makes boatloads of money because the elephants had walked across the bridge and everything is fine. P.T. Barnum, American hero. And the bridge, in fact, is fine. Emily and John go back to Pennsylvania, where the company headquarters are, and they continue to do major projects. Washington and Emily go back to Pennsylvania, and the company continues to do projects. And actually, the Roebling company still exists. It is much smaller than it used to be, and they do specialized steel projects now, but it still exists. And they continue to have a lucrative career for the remainder of their lives, although Washington never recovers fully from what it is that he experienced because of the bends. The bridge itself has some other interesting aspects to it. And the most interesting one to me, because as you may or may not know, I collect wines, so this is of interest to me. When the bridge was being built, the people who were helping to fund it were looking for other ways that they could earn revenue. And one of the things they discovered was that in the bottoms of those two massive vertical structures close to the river, inside of those, there was essentially a temperature controlled area where you could store wine, where the temperature, whether it was summer or winter, was fairly consistent. Of course, for the storage of wine, particularly red wine, that's particularly helpful. So a number of spots where you could store your wine were sold to wine connoisseurs in New York City to store your wine at constant temperature. And a lot of those spaces were sold. Over time, people forgot the wine was there. It didn't become important. So over 100 years after these places were sold, someone was doing an inspection of the bridge and said, wow, what are all these wine bottles doing here? And suddenly it was discovered that, wow, these wine bottles were put there by people who wanted to keep the wine at constant temperature. And now you had a bunch of classic wines that are incredibly valuable. Guess who took credit for selling those and getting the revenue? Yes, indeed, it was the city of New York. It was not because they couldn't track the ownership of who owned the wine, so the city of New York managed to do that. And of course, because it is a bridge and because people can walk across the bridge, younger people who are very much in love and they do this also at other famous bridges like over the Thames and over the Seine River, etc. They take padlocks and they lock the padlocks in some of the grating at the top of the bridge, and they put names on it, and this, cements our love forever, so and so. So there is a work crew at the Brooklyn Bridge who regularly goes back and forth and cuts through all of these padlocks that have been put on the bridge because, they can't stay there. It doesn't look nice, and therefore it's removed. I'm going to show you now that you've gone through most of the story. I'm going to now show you the third video, which is from Encyclopedia Britannica, which kind of gives a bit of an overview. So some of this is now going to be a bit repetitious, but it's got some nice pictures. And then I'm going to make some summary comments about what you hear from this final video in just a minute. Then I've got some final comments to make before we go to Q&A. So let's go through. This is a very short video, so let me get this one going.
Just been finished on the eastern side of Manhattan Island. The Brooklyn Bridge was completed in 1883. The East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn was congested with ferry traffic. Walt Whitman commemorated his experience of the maritime and social chaos in his poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Hundreds of craft once navigated routinely between Brooklyn and Manhattan. When the bridge was finished, that traffic moved effectively to wheel and foot, high above the river. Spanning 1,595 feet in its center section, the Brooklyn Bridge rises with Gothic elegance to suspend a fine lattice of steel cables, a new technology at the time of its construction. Sealed, pressurized caissons around the feet of the bridge held back water and allowed workers to dig the foundation well below sea level. The bridge's designer, John Augustus Roebling, died early in the project. His son and daughter-in-law, Washington and Emily Warren Roebling, finished the job. Washington Roebling became paralyzed by decompression sickness from his frequent visits to the caissons and counted on his wife for support and intelligence as they crafted the bridge. Over 20 other workers died in the construction effort. The bridge embodies a unique application of
That's a strange video because the second half goes into Hegelian philosophy, which has nothing to do with the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. But the first part I find interesting. So let's review what happened. At the time of its construction, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It was an engineering feat. Now, there are suspension bridges in the world that are multiple miles in length. Manufacturing techniques, of course, have improved, not surprisingly, but at the time, it was the greatest structure of its type that had been built. It is built with amazing safety specifications, which is why in 2007, after the Minneapolis bridge collapsed, and it was inspected, it was found to be absolutely safe to be used. It helped the growth of both Brooklyn and New York City. Those two cities are going to combine, of course, to form New York City. There are now 2 of the 5 boroughs in New York, and it helped to make that take place. The bridge itself is an architectural marvel, and of course is studied around the world. The joke about selling or buying the Brooklyn Bridge came from some vaudeville comics in the early 1900s who liked to make jokes about people who visited New York from the Midwest because they were always defined as Hicks and Rubes, and that people could sell them shares in the Brooklyn Bridge because they just weren't knowledgeable people. It was more of a stunt for comics, not something that actually took place. And the bridge remains. And I saw the poll, at least when I saw the poll, it said that about 3/4 of the audience has seen the Brooklyn Bridge. It is very, very impressive, and particularly when you understand all of its background. The 2 vertical towers, by the way, are made out of granite and limestone and some concrete, almost all of which comes from the United States. And the cables were all manufactured by companies in the United States. Obviously, the one went bankrupt, as you heard, but all within the United States as well. And the Brooklyn Bridge is still there and still important and still beautiful to look at. I strongly encourage you to read the book by David McCullough about the Great Bridge. It is superb. Roz just put in chat, at least I think that's chat, but she just sent a note out that it is in the library collection. And of course, Ken Burns did a video about it. Although there weren't many movies about its construction, you've got a general picture of that. Interesting also is the fact that there was very little pneumatic equipment or power equipment that was available at the time. A lot of that was done with horse-drawn power or with manual power, lifting things, moving things, pulling things, etc., because there weren't the sorts of tools that there are now. And the Brooklyn Bridge is still there and still impressive. So that is an overview of building the Brooklyn Bridge. And we are now going to open up a Q&A and chat. I'm going to look at chat first and see if there's something there, and then I will turn to Q&A. We have Roz's comment about the McCullough book and the Burns book, and will there be an available recording? And Roz said that there would be, so we covered that. Then we swing over to Q&A, and an anonymous attendee with a sense of humor said that they're leaving the presentation because they can't buy a share of the bridge, and that was the only reason they came tonight, was because they thought they could actually buy a share. You need not to believe everything I say during presentations, because sometimes I actually do crack jokes, and we were never planned to sell shares. So in any case, if there's more Q&A, I'll be happy to try to respond to it. We'll just wait for a minute.
Gary, the thing about this that always amazes me is that when you think about your last comment about the fact that this was built with like manual power, that the tools they had access to were just so limited, and it's just hard to fathom building this thing at that time. It's just that's unbelievable. That's the incredible thing to me.
It is. That's one of the reasons it took 14 years, though, was because that kind of slows down the process. When will Gary conduct another program? I don't know, but I'm sure I'll do another program with the Vernon Library sometime next year. Roz typically pings ideas at me and says, don't you want to talk about the Supreme Court or something? And then we'll see if we'll put together a program and respond to it. But remember, we have Great Decisions that meets twice a month, 8 months out of the year. And if you are interested in foreign policy, I suggest you look that up, because with Zoom, which is how we're meeting now, attendance can be a little bit larger. So you may want to check that out.
So Gary, there are a couple questions now in the Q&A. Someone's asking, how did the saying about buying the Brooklyn Bridge start?
And that came from vaudeville. They were making jokes about people from the Midwest who were not sophisticated and could be sold shares in the bridge because we're all rubes if we come from the Middle West. Didn't Roebling develop a new way to make the cables? The Roebling company developed a way to make the cables, yes. And they used that process they had developed when they wrote the specs, and then that one company didn't meet the specs correctly. But yes, Augustus actually, among the things he's known for, was developing a new way to construct those sorts of cables, yes. Did the design get any awards? Not that I'm aware of. It did not get any particular awards. No, it's pretty impressive to me, but I'm not aware that it won any awards. No. In The Engineer's Wife, Mrs. Roebling's portrait is very hands-on, historical fiction or not. I have not read the book, The Engineer's Wife. I did read the book by McCullough, and my representation of Emily is she starts with no math or engineering education, understands how important she is, gets frustrated because she doesn't understand the messages that are going back and forth, and goes to night class to start to understand basic math and engineering. So she educates herself, if you will, on the job so she can better understand what she is talking about. So to me, she is the heroine of the entire story. I mean, Washington overcame the bends, and that's important, but Emily's the one who made the project work. But I've not read that book. No, I have not. Chris Christie is selling shares in the George Washington Bridge. Well, Chris Christie probably needs to earn some income because he's not governor anymore of New Jersey. So I hope someone buys some shares. I'm glad he's acting in an entrepreneurial spirit.
How can you sign up for Gary's foreign policy Zooms? Well, you can go to the Vernon Area Library's website and select events, and look at our calendar. And Gary has 2 sessions, one on Fridays, one on Wednesdays every month, except for December and January. So you can just go to, I mean, if that's how you do it, actually go directly to calendar.vapld.info. That'll take you directly to our online calendar, and you'll see Great Decisions Foreign Policy Discussion Group listed twice a month. I hope that helps. And Gary, is there any other bridge that's captured your attention the way this one has?
No, I have a particular love of the Golden Gate Bridge because I simply think it's so pretty. But the story of the construction of that bridge isn't nearly as dramatic and romantic as the Brooklyn Bridge. That kind of stands by itself. But I think the Golden Gate Bridge is absolutely beautiful. I think I like it better than how the Brooklyn Bridge looks, but the story just isn't as interesting.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we answered the questions that came through, and just Gary, thank you for a great story that a lot of us probably were not familiar with. We've probably looked at that bridge dozens of times and never knew kind of the story behind the people that built it. So, so thank you for kind of sharing that with us tonight.
You're welcome.
And everyone, thank you for joining us at home. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.